Hello everyone. As usual for WFA webinars, we are delighted to welcome people from multiple time zones around the world today. I'm seeing in the attendees colleagues from Tokyo, Mumbai and Singapore, to name a few. So a very warm welcome to this webinar today. I'm just going to preempt a couple of questions that we tend to be asked when we do these sessions. Firstly, yes, we will be able to share the presentation with you after this session, and also we'll make a copy of the recording of this webinar available for you to share with your colleagues as you see fit. So today we are going to be focusing on an area which is top of our agenda right now, ad fraud. And just a couple of things to point out before we get going is that this will be an interactive session. We'll be doing some polls during the 30 to 45 minutes that we'll have you with us. And please also, at any point, feel free to pop some questions into the Q&A widget that you should be seeing on the right-hand side of your screen. So very briefly, I think most of you know us, but just to introductions, I'm on the left, and we don't have a guest speaker today, but along with my colleague Matt Green, we're going to be talking you through some of the learnings and the headlines from our ad fraud guidance. And some of you, well, you will have seen emails from Natalia, who will be managing this webinar and taking your questions. So with that, it's worth noting also at this point that really this guidance wouldn't really have been possible without our friend, and I think he described himself as an ad tech veteran. I'm not sure there's that many ad tech veterans, but he qualifies as one, I think, is Mikko Kotila. Many of you know Mikko already. He spent over a decade studying this area and is now principal of an organization called botlab.io. So that's botlab.io, which I urge you to check out when you get the opportunity. And also, of course, this work has been supported by our network of members. So that's now over 80 of the world's biggest brands and multinational companies, and also 60 national advertiser associations. So you'll know the ANA in the US. We have JAA from Japan on the webinar today, but also ISBAR in the UK. So 60 markets around the world. And just to name two of our members who were included within the document and have supported this work. One is Ben Jankowski, who's the chairman of our media forum, and he's also group head global media at MasterCard, and also Luis de Como, who heads up global media at Unilever. And they're both members of our global transparency group, which is a task force, if you like, within the media forum that has really championed this work and other work that we've done. So without going through the quotations, you can see them there, but really all of our members who are involved are keen to stress the severity of this issue, to really underline the importance of advertisers better protecting themselves, and ultimately how important it's going to be for collaboration across our industry to try and fix these problems. So one thing that we've really learned, and frankly Matt and I are still learning as we go through this, is that ad fraud is a complex area, multifaceted you might call it. But in summary, if you were to surmise, I would say it's really, whether it be impression, be click, conversion, or data fraud, it's basically false reporting to criminally gain revenue, and the criminal aspect of that is key here. We're going to focus quite a bit today on programmatic buys, primarily because that's where a whole lot of investment is going, but where we see this has been a particular problem. And just to sort of keep in mind, anyone that tells you that your programmatic buy is not exposed to ad fraud, you need to beware. From our learnings and from Mikko's research, is really any programmatic buy can be exposed to ad fraud. And ad fraud is often referred to as bots. And in fact, some verification companies we're aware of only measure bots, but actually ad fraud can be mechanical or human or both. And one of our co-authors, there were more people other than Mikko involved in this, tells an account of seeing these click fraud farms firsthand. And those of you in the UK might have seen a report from Channel 4 about a similar story out of Bangladesh. It's as I said, a multifaceted area. But I think at this point, what we're going to do is turn over to you with our first poll, and if you could throw that up there. Good. Thank you, Natalia. So the question is, in terms of priorities for your organization, where does ad fraud feature? So if you could respond to one of those, is it critical? Is it a major priority, a mid-ranking priority, a minor priority, or not prioritized at all in your organization? So as you take a second just to respond to those results, I just remind you that there's a Q&A widget on the right where you should be able to post questions to us. I see a couple of people saying they're having trouble with audio. I very much hope that that's been rectified now. But so, okay, if you could close those results, please, Natalia. Thank you very much. Okay, so that's interesting. So 27% of you saying it's a critical highest priority, 33% saying it's a major priority. And this is quite interesting. You may not be aware, but we ran a study, or of course the sample was larger than this, but we ran a study in November, and actually 18% then saying that this was critical, so that's increased to 27, and 21% back then saying it was a major priority. So certainly, as with us, this has risen up your agenda as it has at the WFA as well. So, so thank you very much for that. We will have more polls as we go through. In terms of putting a number on it, this is a really tricky thing to do. We knew that people were going to want us to try and put a number on it, but when we've looked at the different research that exists, really the results range from anywhere from 2% to 90%. So, I mean, we really didn't set out to find a specific number. That wasn't the purpose of this. So what we did was we used existing research and looked at the most robust and reliable sources that we could to provide a little bit of context. And what we did when we went through this was really work to two different scenarios. The first was 10%, and the very conservative, we might say, 10%, and the other was 30%, which if you talk to Miko, he would actually say the reality of ad fraud is probably much higher than 30%. But anyway, as we go through this presentation and as you go through the guidance, those are the two scenarios that we've worked to. And even if you work to the most conservative 10% and assume that that 10% is not going to increase over the next years, once we get to 2025, based on predicted growth of digital media investment, we could be looking at about $50 billion in terms of how much ad fraud would be worth, which would make it second only to drug trafficking in terms of crime. So I think it's probably worth noting at this point the real key difference between this topic, ad fraud, and the transparency issues, which are currently so high on everyone's agendas. And the first is really around the scale of it, as you can see here, even based on conservative scenarios. And the other is really that the fact that ad fraud doesn't just impact on our ecosystem, actually. It impacts on people, so the audience that you're trying to connect with, and society and economy more broadly. So this is a genuinely macro problem that we're talking about, that we're facing. And despite our 10% estimate that we've worked to, the problem is really only set to become bigger based on our understanding. So this chart is borrowed from Hewlett-Packard report, which talks to the potential high pay of different on the vertical axis, and the relatively low effort and risk along the horizontal axis, along the bottom. And as you can see from a criminal perspective, ad fraud kind of represents the sweet spot. I'm not sure I'm supposed to call it a sweet spot, but you can see what I mean in terms of in the top right quadrant there. So, and the reason the risk here has been so low is that really there's been so few cases of prosecutions. In fact, there's only 2 globally that we've come across. And that really needs to change with the help of governments and the authorities. And the lack of complexity, if you like, inherent in this area from a perpetrator's perspective really needs to be added by our industry. So starting with advertisers, taking steps to combat it, which really requires improved understanding. And I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Matt to talk you through some of that.
Well, thanks, Rob. Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of fraud out there and the way in which fraud is commonly perpetrated. So first of all, we talk about 3 primary forms of fraud. That's website, where fraudulent sites are controlled by or affiliated to a perpetrator. Platform, where fraudulent activity is designed to exploit behavior and weaknesses of a social network or video hosting platform. And then data, where user data is exploited or inflated for fraudulent purposes. And website fraud is the form I'd like to focus on first of all. So looking at the image here, viral news sites, viral spam sites, social spam sites, whatever you call them, this image is an example of one of the most prolific forms of fraud. In fact, the majority of the top 5,000 sites available in ad exchanges today are viral news sites. They take a substantial share of the programmatic revenue, while the traffic quality suggests there's little or no potential for advertising effectiveness from these sites. Now, the typical attributes of these sites include there's maybe no details on ownership and no means to contact any individual, maybe low share of organic search traffic, maybe higher than average page views per visit, perhaps a very low bounce rate, and other things besides, but there's a number of different sort of attributes which we need to look out for there. Then there is traffic, and this also belongs within the website fraud category. Now, this slide does take a bit of explaining, so bear with me. Web traffic, basically, back to basics, web traffic basically refers to the number of visitors to sites and pages. And we talk about traffic a lot regarding fraud, really. There's botnet traffic, cookie stuffing traffic, farm traffic, clickjacking traffic, and so on. But more, an industry has also grown up around publishers acquiring traffic from third parties. And typically, this is conducted by media vendors advertising on other publisher sites in order to attract visitors back to the original site. And this is where the problems start. So-called sourced traffic is typically of a very low quality and sometimes is entirely populated by bots. But under pressure to attract media budgets, which are being divested across the social spam sites we talked about earlier, source traffic buying has become widespread among even premium publishers. In fact, source traffic has become to internet publishing what performance-enhancing drugs became to sports. And if you want to compete at the highest levels of the game, the surest way to do that is by resorting to doping. So you can see in the end, I've got around to the purpose of the illustration. I hope that makes sense. But who are the main perpetrators of fraud? Well, by far and away, the most common adversary is so-called black hat marketers. Now, this may sound like something from Harry Potter, but in fact, these are highly skilled marketing technologists who demonstrate very high commitment and a moderate threat. Basically, what Miko, our co-author, could have become. Now, only among organized criminals do we see a higher threat level, but pleasingly, these are yet to enter the fray to a great extent, but we do expect this to change, and this is why Rob talked about such large numbers at the beginning of this presentation. There is clear scope for this to increase massively. That's bad news. Now, it's actually quite easy to understand what black hat marketers are up to. You can just go to sites such as this, Blackout World. So this is just a normal .com site. And there are a number of discussion chat rooms, forums around things such as fraud and other areas of digital marketing. So you can understand a little bit about what these guys are up to, but removing them from the ecosystem is harder than it might seem. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But firstly, I wanted to take some time to illustrate where fraud typically enters the digital media ecosystem. And this is usually a chink in the programmatic chain at the exchange level. So there are a number of intermediaries in a typical programmatic process, and this is something we've covered in our earlier programmatic guidance. But let's just take a look at how the money flow works within the typical agency trading desk setup, which is the most common way of conducting programmatic. So of $100, 60 or so are shared out among the agency of record, the agency trading desk, the demand-side platform, and so on. And we're not saying that you can necessarily dispense with all these intermediaries. If you take a piece away from the house of cards, if you like, then the whole thing falls down. But it's clearly not the most efficient ecosystem, and there is also clear scope for arbitrage within here as well. So you typically end up with around about $40 at the end of working media spend, money that reaches publishers at the end. But when we introduce the impact of ad fraud, we can see that this number falls to maybe 36% or even 28%, depending on the ad fraud scenario that we're applying. And although 30% is our more extreme scenario, we do have strong reason to believe that this could actually be on the conservative end of the spectrum. So you can sort of understand here what your working media budgets might be reduced down to as a sort of consequence of fraud. It's quite severe. So if we add this all back together again to see, how much working, how much non-working you have in the end, one of the most obvious observations is actually the industry that benefits most from ad fraud. That might sound controversial, but it's unintentional, we believe. But of course, media owners still charge for the impressions that they're selling, and agencies still get paid their fee. It's clients who exclusively and entirely lose out from ad fraud. So now I'm going to hand back over to Rob, who's going to elaborate a little bit on how the frauds extract money from the ecosystem. So over.
Thanks, Matt. So one of the questions that we do get asked quite regularly is at what point in the process the fraudsters actually profit, and the answer really is at multiple points throughout it. So as Matt talked through, the money flow, if you like, within a typical programmatic buy through a trading desk, your advertiser pays your agency, who pays the DSP, who pays the exchange, who pays the publisher, or a conduit network who then pays the publisher. And the point here is that certainly further on the right-hand side of that flow chart is that's where the fraudsters are getting involved. And the key thing here is that all the transactions are taking place through the formal banking system. So even if the publisher is a large-scale cyber criminal, they can actually operate as part of the formal economy. So and really, given the scale and the speed of what we're talking about here in relation to programmatic, ad networks and ad platforms really rarely conduct sufficient background checks on the different parties that they're working with, and that's something that really needs to be addressed. And as Matt said, the larger the legitimate ad network or platform, the larger their share of the ad fraud economy, and the harder it is for them to make those checks. And even without any direct involvement or in such activity or having any intent to gain through it. So within the guide, we're now going to move into, if you like, the last section of this webinar. We've started to flesh out some potential solutions, and we're going to take you through some of these now. So just to explain this chart, we've basically put on the left the most complex solutions from to the top left, and the ones that will take the longest to the bottom right. So basically what we're saying is that the areas for initial focus, and we're not going to call them low-hanging fruit, but certainly the starting points really will be around the bottom left of this chart. And the first bucket that I'm going to focus on here is around people and technology, and you should see some of the labels coming up here now. Firstly, at the bottom left is cybersecurity companies. We know pretty much all of you have existing relationships with these organizations. And they're a good point of call, we think, because frankly they're bringing experience from related worlds to bear on this issue. So, for example, cybercrime and finance. And they also come with no vested interest in our industry, which is, of course, very important. And what we're going to do now is just hand back to you guys for a second before we move on. And Natalia, if you wouldn't mind launching the second poll for our members. So this is a very simple question. So talking about resource, internal resource and colleagues, do you have any resource or colleagues within your organization who are specifically dedicated to ad fraud right now? Yes, no, and don't worry if you don't know. Maybe people that you've not come across. So again, as you take a second to respond to that, please do feel free to post your questions in the Q&A widget, and we're going to allow a bit of time, and Matt and I are going to try to address as many of those as we can. So great, Natalia, if you can maybe end that now. I think as again, it's a sort of rough yardstick. So that's interesting. So 10% of those that we have on right now do have dedicated resource in the area, but large majority, 65%, saying they don't. Great, very interesting. Again, thanks for your input there. So coming to that point, I think one of the areas that we recommend that our members really explore and look into in more detail is around internal resource. So even if it's just one person, this sort of expertise is really going to enable you, as in relation to programmatic more generally, really not to be over-reliant on external partners and start to generate real deep understanding of this area, which we think is critical. One sort of proposal for resource, which was suggested by Miko, who we mentioned earlier, during our media forum at Lego in London, was to have four roles within your organization. That doesn't necessarily have to be four FTEs, but his proposal was a team leader, so someone that's overseeing the work on this. Then, if you like, on the left, the brain, or a researcher whose role is to understand and really detect fraud. Then the analytics guy, I know everyone's after these at the moment, they're quite hard to come by sometimes, but someone who takes the insights and forms white lists to share with your buyers, both your internal and your external buyers, meaning your agencies to buy to. And finally, the storyteller. And I think, as with any new area, it's really about keeping sort of key stakeholders, for example, the C-suite, informed of the risks here. So maybe talking about the criminal implications, which obviously strike a chord with C-suite, and also importantly, threat to the bottom line. So that's just one model, and I just say this is one of many areas that we at WFA are going to be fleshing out with the help of our members at our different forums. So in this case, it would be to elaborate on, what capabilities would be required and what might this internal resource look like. And another area which we recently ran a study on is around third-party verification companies, and I've just included results from one slide and the results from that presentation. The question we asked here was, do you work with a verification partner? And you can see of the 33 companies that took part, these are the companies that they're currently working with. By the way, this isn't recommending any companies, we wouldn't do that, but just giving visibility on who our members are working with right now. And as you can see from that study, what's quite interesting is that we found that 66% of our members are actually working with multiple suppliers. And the reason for that, many of you are still really in the trial phase of working with these companies. Third-party verification is a relatively new phenomenon. And one of the challenges being faced by WFA members is really the sort of lack of standardization in this area. This is often reflected in the huge discrepancies that we're seeing between partners. And I think the key thing here is that proprietary solutions that are being applied kind of results in a bit of a whack-a-mole, if you like, when it comes down to ad fraud. So perhaps stating the obvious here, but whilst these companies certainly have a role to play, we'd urge caution in terms of assuming working with these vendors means that you've really kind of ticked the ad fraud box. So to our next bucket, if you like, our next area within the solutions that we applied is the education and communication. So you can see the three that I've thrown up here. And before I hand back to Matt, just Natalia, maybe you could throw up the third poll, please. Great. So Matt, over to you.
Great. So thank you for putting the poll up, Natalia. So the next area we'd like to talk about is education and communication. And there are a number of components within here, such as open information sharing, setting appropriate metrics, and setting clear expectations, and also putting in place the right contractual elements. And that's the reason for the poll. We'd like to ask you, do you currently have any stipulations in your agency contracts which relate to ad fraud? So we're asking you, yes, do you? No, but do we plan to? No, and no plans to, and not sure. And it's going to be quite interesting to see what kind of results come through on this one. So I'm seeing sort of a mixed profile here. So Natalia, maybe you can end this poll now, and we'll put it up on screen so everyone can see. And the majority of people are saying no, we do not have any stipulations for contracts for ad fraud yet, but we do plan to, which makes sense. That's obviously a very sort of prudent step to take. So moving back to the slides. So as I mentioned, there are a number of elements within this education piece, setting appropriate metrics, setting clear expectations, and so on. And I do think that successful behavior change should start with contractual liability. This is how you manifest change in the industry. And as an indication of what this might look like, it might involve applying penalties to vendors if they misallocate spend to ad fraud, where preventing it could be reasonably achieved, I would say. But I do think it is important to start with a clear articulation of expectations. And we're not going to eradicate fraud overnight. It's far too entrenched for that. And our research does suggest that a degree of fraud will actually prevail against any counter fraud measure that you can put in place. So one of the recommendations we put forward in our guidance is that you should use caution about the vendors you work with, because any advice that you're given, any claims that you're given by the vendors you work with that you will be able to remove all fraud, I think you should treat with a significant degree of caution, because our research suggests that can't be true. So what next? Well, penultimately, we look at standards. And this is really more from an industry perspective, I should say. And it is worth mentioning the work that's been done here by the Trustworthy Accountability Group, TAG, which is an organization set up in the USA by the Association of National Advertisers and the IAB. So and they've been working on a number of different standards, so you can find out more from TAG about what those might look like. But for now, focusing on what you can do to protect yourselves, we believe that one of the most important starting points should be to avoid buying blind. And what we start with here is run of exchange buys. And run of exchange buys should be avoided at all costs. Now, these buys, where ads are being bought blindly across millions of sites, are one of the surest ways of allocating money to ad fraud. And an alternative to consider is agreements with agencies whereby inventory is only bought from clients' white or blacklists. So that's a much more prudent approach. It may result, however, in lower overall media volumes for clients, and that's a consideration. But it may be that clients, that we as an industry have to accept that digital targets may not always be achievable without exposing ourselves to high levels of fraud. So we might just have to accept that we can't get away all the inventory we want to, or if you do, you might have to just understand that there's going to be a higher degree of fraud within that. So finally, looking at the governance section, and not least here is pushing for legal consequences or prosecution. And there's few signs to the industry which will have as much impact as this. When we start pushing for legal consequences, that is when the industry will really sit up and take notice. For our part, we have alerted the authorities to our findings, and as we've gone through this process, and this is obviously only the very first step, but that is something we've done, and we do believe that this is an area where we should all be focusing more on. In fact, this is an aspect, this legal dimension is an aspect which we've begun to focus on within our DGX, our Digital Governance Exchange, and Rob was at that a couple of weeks ago. This is a hybrid group which brings together marketers and public affairs professionals and legal colleagues. So it's sort of the very sort of interesting area for ad fraud, I think, an interesting space where we can talk about these legal dimensions, which will be increasingly important for ad fraud. So that's all for me. Now I'm going to just sort of invite everyone in the room to fire any questions at us that you might have. And as Rob said earlier on, just stick your questions in the Q&A widget or in the chat box, and we'll be very, very happy to take any questions that might come up.
Just as we waiting for people, and we've had a few questions come in, I just wanted to make one observation in relation to sort of contractual compliance. There's quite interesting work being done at the local level, for example, by ISBA in the UK, including contract templates in terms of whitelists that you might be working with, and how you might contractually insist that your agency partners work to those. So I encourage you to speak to ISBA, especially if you're a member of those, but to ask for their support in that area. So a couple of questions that have come through. One is around the sort of, we were talking about the roles and resources within organizations, and what's the best sort of background experience in relation to the storyteller. I think that's a good question, but I think to some degree that's something that, whilst we'd have personal opinions on, would be something that we'd need to work within our forums just to really define what that individual looks like and what that role exists within the organization, because it's almost an internal comms role that they'd be playing, but obviously need to have the gravitas and the experience to be able to communicate that with the C-suite. So some other questions is, can you audit for fraud with traditional media audits? So from our understanding, I think I'm allowed to name names here. I know Ubiquity have done quite a good bit of work, Matt, in relation to sort of analysing and reviewing the different verification partners that exist right now. So I think, certainly media auditors have a role to play, but it's less direct than it would be, for example, with your cybersecurity companies or with those third-party verification companies.
Another question coming in here: which ad types contribute most to fraud? Is that display banner ads, I presume? Most likely, this is going to be mostly concentrated around banner ads. It's true. These represent the greatest share of digital media ad formats. So this is where ad fraud is going to be concentrated most. But this is we are also seeing this increasingly in the video space, in the social space. There's not really anywhere which is entirely immune from ad fraud, I'm afraid to say, but yeah, it's likely initially it's going to be most concentrated within that display area.
Yeah, absolutely. And one question that came through, we're going to please drop us a line if you've not seen someone asking if there's a compendium of common ad fraud types. The answer is yes, it's within the guidance. Drop us a line if you have any if you haven't seen a copy of it, and we'll of course share it with you. Another interesting question, we've had this come up in a couple of our meetings, was how can we kind of highlight this without scaring marketers away from investing in digital? That's a very good question. As you know, many of you on this webinar have spent many years trying to justify and increase investment in digital marketing overall. And the purpose of this isn't to throw the baby out with the bathwater, if you like, or to limit innovation or investment in digital. However, we would say that one of the sort of strongest levers that you have as brand owners, of course, is whether or not you spend in this area. So it's more about urging caution and having understanding in the areas that you're investing before you approach it. So and longer term, that's gonna benefit everyone. So this isn't about asking people to limit their spend in digital. It's just about applying caution overall. And one other question was really about the plans that we have for this. Yes, we did mention this a bit at the beginning. So really what we're going to be doing, and I'm going to show you here some of the meetings that we've got coming up, is that we're going to be tackling this topic in many of our different forums. So for example, our media and sourcing forums will be meeting in Shanghai next week, and those two groups, not just in Shanghai but globally, the sourcing forum will probably be well placed to focus on the contractual areas that Matt mentioned, and media perhaps more focused around what those capabilities look like within your media department. Anything to add?
No, not really. Just as Rob mentioned, the media forum, the sourcing forum coming up in Shanghai on 7th July should be great sessions, and this topic will feature there. So if those of you who are based in China or in the region, please do come along. It should be a really great session.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you who aren't in that market, we will also be running more of these sessions and remote forums to really sort of drill down to solutions that we can basically work on together. And I thought, I mean, this may sound like a bit of a cliche, but one of the interesting things in relation, or sort of optimistic angles on this whole area, is that basically the fraudsters that we're dealing with, so the perpetrators that we're talking about, the one thing that we have over them is the ability to work together, and in often cases those guys are basically not the best of friends and not really used to collaborating with one another. But as an industry and as brand owners, a community of advertisers, that is something that we certainly have over our adversaries. So last one there is in terms of a question around what are the legal consequences of fraud. The answer is that at the moment there haven't been enough consequences and there haven't been enough precedents set, and that's something that we need to push for, as Matt mentioned. For our part, we have actually reported our findings to the authorities, and it's going to be something that needs to happen in multiple markets around the world, because if there's no precedent set, then frankly the threat for the perpetrators we've been talking about as we've gone through this presentation is going to be limited. So Matt, anything else to add?
No, thank you. Hopefully you find the guidance useful. You can check it out on our website. And yeah, as we've said throughout this presentation, really, this is just going to be increasing focus for us, and we'll be tightening up the guidance we provide in time. So please stay tuned. There'll be more from us.
Absolutely. So really just remains for us to say thank you very much for joining us today. As I said, if you've not seen the guidance yet and would like a copy, or if you've got any further questions, you can see my and Matt's contact details here. Now, this is obviously the start of a journey for many of us, and we look forward to collaborating with you and fighting the good fight, if you like. So Thank you again for joining us today, and have a great rest of the day and weekend, and we look forward to speaking with you soon. Thank you.
Bye bye.